And then there's other things which I mentioned in the book. We've talked extensively here in these interviews we've done about the Star Child skull.
Yeah.
And we did probably a couple of hours on that, or an hour on that. And I've got a couple of chapters in that in the book, because I was involved with that, as we discussed. People can go back and watch those other interviews that you've done for us. And I talk about, for example, Steven Greer. And I've got another chapter on him, but specifically about the Star Child skull. Lloyd told me, Lloyd Pye that is, that he was at a convention, a UFO convention, probably early 2000s, I think. And Steven Greer was at the same convention, and I think Lloyd either struck up a conversation with him, or I don't think initially he would have known who Greer was, but then he found out he was an ER doctor. And so, he's a doctor, he'd be interested in this skull. And showed it to him, and apparently Steven Greer picked it up and said, it's very interesting, and put it down again. And then you look at that Sirius film that he did in 2013, and he goes on about the Atacama alien. And he's got a whole, that's in fact the central bit of the film, that was meant to be the big revelation in that film. Yet if you listen to what Dr. Gary Nolan says in that film, he doesn't say it's an alien. In fact, he implies that it's almost certainly human. It's a human, some type of human fetus that's malformed or deformed. And I think if you look at Greer's report on his website about that, it's inconclusive, what it is. It doesn't say it's alien. It's not. They've got nothing like the amount of evidence that they have for the Star Child skull, which we went through in detail. Apparently Greer's not interested in that. Why? It should have been at Lloyd Pye saying, I've got all this disclosure project money, I'm worth 14 million, which apparently is what Greer's been worth in the past. And yet he's still asking for money. He's doing it again now. He's been making another film this year.
Oh yes, he is. Yeah,
he's making another film, and he's been asking for money and support on that. But so you think, let's get that Star Child. We're going back probably to say early 2000s, so like over 15 years. I've never heard Greer talk about it in any of his presentations. But yet he backs up what he's saying, with physical evidence. He says that aliens are real and they're doing all this stuff, according to him. Well, here's the physical evidence. Why? I bought a replica, why isn't Greer buy one of the replicas at least? Hold it up in his lectures, look, this is the best evidence we've got of an alien being. All the signs, we can't prove it's an alien 100%, but everything we've done, every test that we've done on this skull, looks like it's not. It looks human, but it's not. There's no way it's even close to human. I've never heard Greer saying that. I've never heard Richard Dolan saying that. Nor have I heard any of the other prominent UFO researchers saying it. It barely gets a mention.
Did you show it to, I don't know, it was you or Lloyd, show it to the recently late Stanton Friedman?
Correct. I'd really like that story in the book. Similar story.
Yeah.
I think it was. I was trying to just check this when I was putting the book together, because what Lloyd told me was, unless my memory is slightly, unfortunately he's not around to ask him and confirm this, but he said that he went to the 60th anniversary of Roswell, which would have been 2007, which is about the right timescale. And I don't know whether it was the Roswell convention itself, or it was another convention in another city for commemorating the 60th anniversary. I can't remember. But he said that he had a table at this conference and he was selling his books and whatnot, and he'd taken the real Star Child skull with him that time for the anniversary, not the replica, because the replica he kind of gave back to, the replica he got made I think in 2002, and he was carrying that round. But in the Roswell thing, he'd taken the real skull, and he said to Stanton Friedman, Stanton, because he knew who he was by then, would you like to have a look at the Star Child skull? And he said, I'll have a look tomorrow. And the next day, here it is, I've still got it, it's like the real one, I don't normally carry this. No, I'll have a look later on. Never looked at that. It's a Stanton Friedman, And the other thing with Stanton Friedman, I say in the book, I like the guy. I met the guy, I met him at I think because you go to Homeforth when was that the year after? Did you see Stanton Freeman at Homeforth? I think you maybe went the year after that.
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah,
2015.
Mhm.
And I met him there, you know, and it was nice to meet him, and had a little bit of a chat with him. And but going back to 2004 or 2005, I was enthusing in 2004 or 5, and I've got the email in the book. I managed to dig it out of my archive because I've got some emails going back 20 years now. Some of my oldest emails that I've got stored away are from 1997, so they're over 20 years old. And the one I had from Stanton Freeman, where I was enthusing about the Disclosure Project, and I was saying that, yeah, I think the big thing with Greer was that he put together the UFO issue and the energy issue, and I still think that. And Stanton Freeman wrote back, and I've got the email in there, I think it was a mistake to link the UFO and the energy issue. I'm thinking, what, really? Why? You worked with a nuclear-powered rocket program in top secret in the 60s. You know about energy, you know about nuclear physics. He's got a master's in nuclear physics. So why would you say such a thing? I mean, it's clear that these craft have some type of weird energy phenomena associated with them. You know, all the witness accounts, the way they get in close range, relate well, I'll say all, a vast, majority of them relate some type of experience which is to do with an energy effect, an anomalous energy effect. Hair standing on end, radio going off, radio going dead in your car, tingling sensation, heat effects where there's no obvious heat, levitation, all this stuff has been reported in the various counts at one time or another, hasn't it? Yeah, Stanton Friedman apparently thinks it's a mistake to think about energy in the UFO issue, according to what he wrote to me back then. And he'd been talking, by 2004, he'd been talking about UFOs for 35 plus years, and he continued to do it up until his death, as you know. He died on the way back from a Toronto talk, or was he going there? I can't remember, but he'd been involved with doing a UFO talk right to the time he died, and I was pretty sure that's what would happen to him, because he was so dedicated to the subject, for which people like me are rightfully very grateful, and he got some good documents out, and but it's like, again, he seemed to get up to a certain point, and then he couldn't go beyond it for whatever reason. He couldn't go.
So have you got a reason why? It's
I don't really know, but again, if we go back to 9/11, the other thing that I made a deliberate effort in 2015 was to give him a copy of the Where Did the Towers Go book, and I personally gave him that copy, free of charge, and I've got a picture in the book of him holding it, and I knew, for example, that Stanton Friedman was extremely good at responding to emails, and so I wrote to him. It was I think he'd had the book for about 18 months. And I'd heard that he had spoken about 9/11, and I didn't put this in the book, so I didn't get round to tracking it down. So anybody that's watching this can correct me if I'm wrong. But he talked about thermite and the towers being, having thermite put in. I understand that he did talk about that on at least one interview. Whether he said that was, he believed that that's what happened, or I don't know, because I haven't been able to find that interview. I did have a look for it, I couldn't find it. So if anybody can find that Stanton Friedman interview, which was probably done in about 2013, 2012, 2014, probably sometime after 2012, I think, was when it would have been done. So I remember somebody mentioning it to me, and I didn't go and check it out. I should have done, really. This was years ago now. And he was going on about thermite and stuff. So I wanted to make sure he had a copy of Where Did the Towers Go. And so I wrote to him about a year after he had it, and I said, have you read Where Did the Towers Go book? And I sent him the picture, which is in that book, attached to the email, just to remind him, so that, because he goes to hundreds of these conferences, he might have no clue who I was, why should he, if he's talking to 100 people every weekend, he's not going to remember everyone he talks to, is he? So that's why I sent him that picture to jog his memory, and of course got no response. So what I also did, I think around the same time it's in the book, is I sent him another kind of email, which was kind of a bit of a test, I admit that, about the Peruvian mummies. There were these Peruvian alien mummies which had allegedly been discovered. And this would have been 2016, I think. Yeah, so I wrote to him in 2016, so he'd had the book about a year. Peruvian mummies, 2016, I think it was. And I said to Stanton, what do you think of those Peruvian mummies? Because I'd looked at them and I thought, probably a hoax. And I just kind of, I didn't really have an interest in it. And immediately within about 2 hours I got the response back, yeah, I'm not sure, wait for more information. That was it, you know. So he got my email and he responded to it. But apparently he didn't choose to respond to the one I asked him about where the towers go. You know, so I don't know. Some people said, Bill Cooper said that Friedman was working for the CIA. You know, was he? I mean, you certainly don't really get that impression. You get an impression of a diligent researcher who's interested in the subject. He's got a bit of a sense of humour. You know, he gently mocks the skeptics in a kind of non-threatening way, in a good way, and always makes valid points. You don't get the impression of somebody working for the CIA. You know, why won't you talk about 9/11? You know, why did he never sort of really get into that? You know, he didn't really go much beyond what he discovered in the Roswell case. You know, he brought out a lot of information about that. But then most of the other stuff he did was primarily sort of lights in the sky. Okay, there were other things. He investigated the Flatwood Monster case, and he looked at the Betty and Barney Hill case. But you know, even that, they wrote their own book on that with another guy, not with Stanton Friedman. So again, it's like he was only operating within certain bounds. You know, whereas I'm interested in it all. You know, and so there's a few examples like that in the book of where I've been critical of other researchers, which some people won't like. You know, and
I think it's important so you can gauge it better. I think you can gauge the information better, so you can look at yourself really with that in mind, and then you come to your own conclusions. You know,
You know,
I think it's a good thing to do. I think we all should. No, obviously, I mean, whenever you are critical, it's always done in a very genial kind of way. You know, I've never known you to be, you know, personal attack, because you're not like that.
No. Again, that's not what
it's a different.
It's not what it's about. You know, a person can have a certain type of personality and certain character traits and stuff, but when they apparently are not interested in certain types of evidence and don't talk about it,
you just want to know why, don't you?
You want to know why. Because and the simple reason for that is that's how the main cover-up works. You know. And I've said it probably would have said in this interview already, I'll say it again. We, as interested people in these sorts of subjects, criticise the mainstream media for not discussing certain types of evidence, not giving it a fair hearing, not presenting it in, you know, the right sort of way, or trying to debunk it or ignore it. So when you get researchers that are supposed to be interested in this sort of thing doing the same thing, then I think that's valid criticism, and it should be spotlighted. You know, and if a researcher says, and I've said this before, I'm sure, well, yeah, I've heard about that, but I haven't studied it, so I don't know. That's fair. I'd say fair enough then. You know, but when I've given them a whole book about 9/11, and then they don't even comment on it, you know, if he'd written back to me and said, "Oh, sorry, I've been really busy, I haven't got around to reading it," you know, fair enough. You know, I can't force him to read it. He's why should he read it? You know, he doesn't have any. I haven't paid him to read it, or he hasn't agreed to review it or anything. Why should he? You know, so I don't know. But I find it peculiar when it's a subject which does link things together that he wouldn't have read it. And the same, and even worse, can be said of Steven Greer. You know? I've got a whole chapter on Greer in there. Did you manage to get to read that? Cause
I've not up to that yet, but yeah, I've looked at content. Oh, can't wait to get to that comment.
Good. Yes, I mean Greer, who I've probably talked about in these interviews before, but it's worth bringing out some of the things which I put in that book, because I went into it a little bit more. And when I was writing that book, there were several books that I decided to read which I hadn't read before. You know, I'd been meaning to read and hadn't, but in finishing that book, that was the motivation to read these other books. So, for example, I read, and I can recommend this book, people read it, the Scott Ramsey book on the Aztec crash. That's a really good one. And he talks about this, and I'll come to Greer again in a minute, but just to mention some of the books I had read in writing that book. The Aztec crash, which was called, I forget the title of that book, but it's published in 2015 by Scott Ramsey and his wife. Gosh, I should remember her name. It's in there. And they basically proved that, to my satisfaction, that a craft had sort of not exactly crash landed, but had either a forced landing or sort of not exactly a soft landing, but not exactly a crash landing where it was destroyed completely. In 1948 in Aztec, and this was about 8 months after Roswell. You know, for example, they found the road because they had to build a road to recover this thing, and that road is still there. And there's like a slab of concrete it goes up a slight incline of maybe like up to 100 feet above the ground in that area, and there's like a slab of concrete that's there, still there, this mysterious sort of slab of concrete, and it's like in the middle of the fucking desert area sort of thing, basically, and this rocky terrain. And he got in touch with people who said they were at the crash site, and this was where they put the crane. They had a crane which they had to put down to lift this disc and put it on the back of a truck. And then they had people who had to go and sanitise the site, so they made it look as if nothing had crashed there, and that took 2 weeks. And then he spoke to another guy, and that's all in his book, who said, all those records, I had to falsify those records because all those personnel that were on that site in that 2 week or 4 week period, I had to alter all their records to say that they were on another base. Actually got a witness who said that that's what he did in 1948, and that's all in Scott Ramsey's book.
The alibis kind of thing.
Correct. And that as far as I'm concerned, that the disc crashed there. I think it was 100 foot in diameter, so it's quite big, I think, if I remember that rightly. I think it was quite a big one. And there were 18 bodies inside. And they looked humanoid, but except they were burned. And, a guy went up to it and he poked a rod and a portal opened and he went inside it, And there were quite a few witnesses that they got in the Ramsey's book that basically corroborated that story. And then we had the guy who tried, because, for example, most people thought that story was a hoax perpetrated by a chap called Silas Newton, who had apparently got this device which was some type of anti-gravity detector or something. And this was all woven up into a hoax story, and everyone, after about 1950, everyone assumed it was a hoax, because Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, it gave some details about the Aztec crash, although I don't think at that point he knew where it was. But the Ramseys followed up that story later. Because even Stanton Friedman, he thought the Aztec story was a hoax. But when he read Scott Ramsey's book, his first book, he agreed that it really did happen. And I think that's quite an important case which they uncovered. And again, Scott Ramsey, I think, he's a sort of researcher. He researched that case for 30 years. 30 years he spent doing it. He started investigating it, I think, because he used to sell electrical cabling around the country, and I think he was in that area, and somebody mentioned something about UFO crash, and it piqued his interest. And that was about 1985 or something. 30 years he investigated for. And another interesting thing he uncovered was that there was something in that story which said that it was to do with the radar in that area. There was a radar installation in that area, and this had been involved in either detecting the craft or bringing it down. That's apparently what he'd found out from his research. And he went to all the people. There's no radar facility here. There's no Air Force here. There's no Air Force base. There's no, there is no radar. There was no radar facility built here. It's not there. But then what he found out was that this was fairly near, or within a sort of 100 miles, I think it was, or 150 miles, of Los Alamos National Laboratories where this happened. And what was happening at Los Alamos was they were building the first atomic bomb.
Mm.
And Los Alamos was worried that they would be a target for enemy action, enemy airstrikes. So what did they have built? They had a radar facility built, a top secret one, and they found where this was, and they went to the site and they found the buildings where this radar facility was. I think it was built in, would have been like 46 or 47 or something. He found all the history behind it. It's there. He went to the building. So everyone that was saying there's no radar facility, they were all wrong because he found it. And as I say, it was built essentially as a monitoring station for Los Alamos, which you wouldn't think of that. You would obviously immediately associate a radar installation with an Air Force base, wouldn't you, or an Army base? You wouldn't think of it being associated with a research establishment at Los Alamos, but that's what it was for. You found people that were involved with building it or knew of it, when it was in operation. I think it was shut down in the early 50s, and obviously it was top secret, so it's in the middle of nowhere. So it just becomes a bit of a myth until you actually drive out there and go and find it. If you manage to get access to the top secret documents which tell you where it is, and you go and look there, you ain't going to find it, are you? When it's all fallen down and it's in the middle of a wilderness area. But that's what he did. So that's what you call good research. But you say again, he doesn't go beyond that. He just sticks on the Aztec case and everything to do with that, and he doesn't go much beyond it. And he openly says that that's what he's doing, which is both a good thing because it means he can get to the truth of that particular case and not be distracted from it. He's got a good nose for all of that. But it's kind of a shame in some ways that he doesn't. Well, so how much was known about Aztec? Did they? What's the connection of the knowledge of that case to the knowledge of what happened with the Roswell disc? Is there any? Let's go into that area, sort of thing. That's what I'm like. Anyway, that's a sort of minor criticism really, because obviously you've only got a certain number of hours in the day where you can do these things. But that's a good recommended book is Scott Ramsey's book about the Aztec crash. I mentioned in there. And another good one which kind of ties in a little bit with that. 'Cause one of the things which when I read the Scott Ramsey book, he mentioned the Dulce base. People have probably heard the Dulce base. And this story of it being an underground base run by aliens, and there was a war there in the 70s, and this Phil Snyder guy was shot by an alien. And
his dad worked there or something?
His dad worked apparently on the Philadelphia experiment.
Oh yes, that's it, yeah.
Called Otto von Snyder, apparently, according to him. So that's his connection into the sort of UFO culture. So Scott Ramsey had written in his book that was a load of rubbish. He said it was the biggest story of disinformation. Now, when I read that, I thought, well, that's a bit dismissive, Scott. Why do you say that? And I was a bit critical of that because I thought he was too dismissive of it. But then a couple of months later, I came across a book by Greg Valdez, who's written a book called Dulce Base. Now, I think it only had a limited print run. I think he self-published it, and you can't get it easily in paperback or hardback anymore. But there is a PDF version available on either Internet Archive or something, and I've got links to that on my website and in that book. And this Greg Valdez book tells you all about the Dulce story. And Greg Valdez is a very good person to tell that story because he is the son of a chap called Gabe Valdez, who was going out and looking at all the cattle mutilation cases which started happening in the mid-70s up until, I think they were going until the mid-90s, so it was about 20 odd years. Now Greg Valdez was probably born in the 70s, I think. He's probably about 10, 15 years younger than me. And so he was going out with his dad to these farms where they had mutilated cattle. He was in his dad's patrol car, many days. So he saw these things. He was right up close. And if you read that book, it kind of unpacks the Dulce Bay story very, very well. And for example, I was a bit hazy when I was rereading some of this, that the Dulce Base story came out of the Paul Benowitz case. And this Paul Benowitz case is well known in ufology. And that Paul Benowitz was an electronics guy, and he was actually building, I think, sensing equipment which he was selling to the Air Force. He was an electronics genius, space electronics expert, and he actually lived across the road, and I mean literally across the road from Kirtland Air Force Base. And he had radio equipment, which was, specialised radio equipment, and he ended up picking up these signals from Kirtland Air Force Base. And he was clever enough to be able to try and decode these signals. And at one point he realised that these were sort of secret transmissions. And the Air Force then somehow got to know that he'd been picking these transmissions up. Maybe he'd spoken to somebody in a bar or a pub or something, and then that word got back to the Air Force. And they set Richard Doty on him, who is this well-known UFO disinfo operative. And Doty sort of said, the Air Force was really interested in his work and they wanted to know more about these signals that they picked up. But what they were doing is they were monitoring him. And what they did was the Air Force gave him a personal computer, an early computer, to help him decode these messages. But what, of course, was happening is the Air Force were feeding him those messages, talking about alien invasions and all this sort of thing. And what had actually happened was Benowitz had stumbled on two classified programs, one of which was called Project Starfire. And at that time what they were doing, and this has become more well known since, they were, from Kirtland Air Force Base, they were firing a laser up into space and reflecting it off Russian satellites which were going over. And the objective of that was they developed this technique called, I think the correct name is speckle interferometry. And what this allows you to do is if you fire a laser up into the atmosphere, you can measure what comes back, and that can allow you to measure how much atmospheric turbulence there is. And then you can have a system of active optics. So you can actually have a mirror on a telescope and you can jiggle this mirror at high speed, and it can jiggle in such a way as it can cancel out much of the turbulence in the atmosphere, resulting in a clearer image. And so when they were trying to get a ground image of a Russian satellite going over, before using this technique it was just a blur, but when they used this technique with the laser firing up, they could tell which satellite it was and they could see its shape. And then once they were able to do that, they were actually able to send pulses to the satellite and reprogram it. That's what Paul Benowitz had stumbled upon. He'd stumbled on evidence of this project. He didn't know what it was, but they wanted to make sure he didn't find out what it was, because in the mid 80s it was top secret. And then he found out that there was some communication with this base at Dulce. I forget the exact story that's in the Gabe Valdez book. So Paul Benowitz was convinced there was a base at Dulce, and he actually had his own light aircraft. Paul, he had a private pilot's license, and he was quite a well-off guy. He had his own small aircraft, and he flew up there. He flew like however far it is. It's a bit of a distance, like a couple of 100 miles, I think. Not far if you've got an aircraft, And he flew up there, and he flew over the Dulce Mesa, and he saw this wreckage on the Mesa of this plane that had crashed. And he was told by the Air Force that it was a nuclear-powered aircraft that they were developing. And of course nobody believed him, because they went and flew up to this place and they couldn't see anything. But he did take pictures, and if you look at one of the pictures in the Valdez book, you can see that there was a crash site. So he was told about a crash site, and so that he became aware of another classified program. And they gave him some story about it. But in other words, it was a real program, but it was different to what they told me. I don't think it was a nuclear-powered aircraft, because so eventually somebody went up to the site, and they went to Geiger counters, and there was no radiation or anything, so they knew it wasn't a nuclear-powered aircraft. And then that story of the Dulce base all came out through Paul Benowitz, because one of the big things was that he was contacted by Richard Doty, I think, told that there was this woman who was an alien abductee. She'd been to the Dulce base, and she came out with a story under hypnosis about these aliens sort of capturing humans and doing experiments on them in this base underground of the Dulce Mesa. And he put this story out into the UFO community, and they took it and ran with it. And it was a bit later that Phil Snyder came on the case. And but what happened was that Gabe Valdez, the police guy, he was a police, he was a sort of police guy in the Dulce area. He looked at all these stories, and he actually checked all these people out, and he ran background checks on Phil Snyder and all these other people that came out. And he found out, for example, that Phil Snyder was in a massive amount of debt, and various other factors, and I think he had a gambling habit or something, and there were various other background checks that he did, and he came to the conclusion that Phil Snyder had made his story up basically to get attention and get money from the UFO circuit, which I think he did a bit, and I think he investigated how Snyder was killed as well, and he just came to the conclusion that that story that he was putting out almost certainly wasn't true. So this idea that this Dulce base had aliens in it and there was a fight with aliens in the 70s, he thought that was just another cover story. Now it's him and another couple of guys, and this is in the Gabe Valdez book, discovered, yes, there is a Dulce base, and it is, and there was confusion about where it was, because there's the Dulce, it's called the Archuleta Mountain, there's the Archuleta Mountain and the Archuleta Mesa, right? They're two places, and they're about 5 miles apart. I looked on Google Maps, they're about 5 miles apart. And people were saying that this base was on the Archuleta Mesa, right? But what they found was that this base was on the Archuleta Mountain, not the Archuleta Mesa, and it's a lot more difficult to get to this Archuleta Mountain because there's not a real road. You can go so far up in a 4x4, but then you've literally got to get out, get a machete, and spend hours and hours and hours chopping your way through, all this brush, this scrub and bush, and to actually get to where this base was. And guess what? They found a vent in the ground with air coming out of it, hot air coming out of it. And this was right where people had said that they'd seen something coming in and going into the mountain at night, nights for years. So they came to the conclusion that there is a base at Dulce, but what is it? Gabe Valdez and his son, Greg Valdez, writes that it is an off-site laboratory for Los Alamos. It's connected to Los Alamos National Laboratories again, which keeps coming up. And they even found in one of the cattle mutilations they found gas masks next to the carcass. And then they found this weird, and there's a picture in his book, and I've got it in my book, copied it into my book, of a sort of weird looking sphere, which was about yay big, about that big, about sort of 5 inches in diameter. And they said that this was what they thought this was a non-lethal weapon. And this sphere, which might have been one of these things that was seen hovering off the ground, was somehow involved in the mutilations. And he thought that the mutilations were being done because they were monitoring radioactivity in the Dulce area. And he also, in the Greg Valdez book, this is important information about, they were doing in the 1960s underground mining of sorts with atomic explosions. And they actually put bombs, atomic bombs underground to access either ores or something. They were doing mining underground using atomic bombs. And this is all in the documentation. It's all, you got all the documents for this. And so what it appears that what had happened was they basically sort of cocked up with this. They didn't, whatever precautions they were supposed to have taken didn't really work very well. And of course some of the radiation was leaking out of where it was supposed to be kept. And that they think that some of the mutilations were being done in secret to monitor the radiation which had got out into the environment in the cattle in that area. So they thought that at least a proportion of it was being done, and it was using some type of stealth aircraft technology. And he gives his reasons for saying this, and the evidence that they uncovered over like 20 years, over which these cases were happening, him and his father. And he said that because Gabe Valdez, the policeman, he died, I think in 2011, I think it was. And he said, Greg Valdez said he went to his dad's house, and he had a garage full of stuff, documents, and because he hoarded all this stuff, all these reports and documents. He'd been collecting it for 20 years. So Greg Valdez had all those documents which showed all this investigation. So, I recommend anyone reads that Greg Valdez book. And I've seen, I think, one interview with that guy. You know, there's loads of interviews about the Dulce base, and Colonel X is the latest one. Anthony Sanchez, he wrote a book about it in 2010. There's the Phil Snyder story, but of course hardly anyone has spoken to Greg Valdez, who actually investigated the events happening in that area firsthand. You know, he's right on the lower end of the attention scale. You know, so I cover that in the book, and that when I read the Greg Valdez book, it was a real page turner for me, because I've always been interested in that Dulce Bay story, and I thought, you know, read it. Oh, so this is what it was. This is what it was about, and you can see again how it's disinformation, how they've given out some of the truth, like they gave some of the truth to Paul Benowitz. Yes, there was a classified aircraft program being developed at Kirtland Air Force Base. He actually accidentally, in fact, he was given more information than he should have been given by Richard Doty, and they eventually were basically sacked, and they had to go and, you know, they were taken off and moved elsewhere away from Paul Benowitz, because they essentially gave him a bit too much information, which in essence didn't really matter, because the myth had already built up in the UFO community, so the cover-up was maintained. The cover-up of whatever was going on at Dulce, which was probably some type of biological monitoring program, was covered up, and it's still been covered up. You know, you still hear all those stories about nightmare halls and, you know, level 7 underground of Dulce. You know, I mean, you know, I don't know whether that story is totally untrue, but if you read the Greg Valdez book, you get a plausible explanation, to me, of what the Dulce story really is.